So let's get into what the supposed topic of today's video is, which is Same Bed, Different Dreams by Ed Park. If you're not familiar with this just came out from Random House Books on November 7th. You can get your copies online or in your local bookstores that sells new books. And it is just over 500 pages. I would call it definitely a work of postmodernism, metafictional elements.
Yep.
The big comparison, which we've talked about before a little bit, was to Gravity's Rainbow. I don't think either of us agree with that as far as writing style. It's much more approachable, much more approachable than Gravity's Rainbow. Thematically, there are certainly similarities. You felt that the writing style was more akin to Libra by Don DeLillo. I thought there were some kind of elements of infinite jest in there. Some of the humor and the fragmented introduction of some of the characters is similar.
Yep, I agree with that.
But really, honestly, I think it's quite unlike anything I've ever read before.
Yeah, and I think, I don't remember if I said this when we briefly talked about this in our last episode before we got into the Sympathizer. I don't remember if I said this then or if it was just something we exchanged between texts or whatever. But, you know, I think it's kind of like I alluded to a few episodes ago when we were kind of talking about the comparison to Pynchon and how I didn't really like that.
Yeah.
I think it's, again, one of those works where it like checked off enough boxes of similarities, excuse me. You know, it's got some secret government type stuff. It's got, you know, mega tech corporations that kind of seem to have their finger in everything. It's got paranoia. It's got alternate history. It's got some slapstick hijinks.
Yes.
You know, and it has that kind of fragmented narrative that all kind of weaves and comes together in different ways.
Yeah.
And, you know, like I said, it just checked off those boxes. I think I had said this to someone else, like it has a lot of Pynchon-esque characteristics.
Yes.
But as a work in and of itself, I don't think it was very Pynchon-esque, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of people who would pick up Thomas Pynchon and be like, I don't know what's going on. This is not for me. I don't care for this style of writing at all, which is totally respectable and understandable.
Yeah.
I don't feel this way about Same Bed, Different Dreams, even though it is like the way it's written is so wonky.
Right.
And just so people, maybe we can go over that a little bit without spoiling anything. Essentially, one of the characters in the book reads a book called Same Bed, Different Dreams.
Yes.
That's where that metafictional element starts to come into play.
Yes.
And in the book, they're recounting dreams, but they're done basically as bullet points.
Yeah.
And so there's like a dream sequence was maybe 40 bullet points, and they're like little fragments of stories.
Some of them are like just a single sentence or a couple sentences.
Yeah.
Some of them are like a full paragraph.
Right.
I think the longest one's probably like 2 or 3 pages.
Yeah, like, and I'll give an example. Maybe it's my one flag. That's a whole page and a half. But yeah, like here's an example. The Koreans are certainly a handsome race, she writes. For this line alone, she is the first non-Korean unanimously and posthumously inducted into the Korean provisional government. That's basically it. Like,
You're right.
you know, there's a little bit before that about who the character they're talking about, but so it's kind of fragmented, and at first it doesn't really make sense, but as the book goes on, it starts to tie everything together.
Yes.
Which leads me to, I want to know your thoughts on what would you say this book is about? If you had to say, what's the point of this book, or what is this book about? If you had to put it in 1 or 2 sentences, what would you say that is?
1 or 2 sentences might be tricky because I'm going to think out loud and ramble a little bit. But like, I think...
And I can't wait for Ed Park to watch this, hopefully, and laugh at how stupid we are.
Right. I think, and I definitely would like to get a second read through in sooner rather than later. I'm taking some time to just let it kind of marinate and digest a little bit. But I was so enamored with it. I read it all in a single weekend, and I'd like to at least attempt to.
Not to cut you off early here, but honestly, I think that might have been better because I was reading something else along with it, and it took me about maybe a week and a half to get 10 days to get through it. And sometimes I was like, wait, what character was this again? And like, what was it? How was this connected? And I feel like if you had done it in one shot, those connections would have been a little clearer.
Right. But one thing that kept coming back to me after I had finished it, and this is a line that's repeated often throughout the book, is what is history?
Yeah.
And I think, without getting too much into the plot, like I think that is what this book is about, is what history is.
Yeah.
Or trying to understand what history is. I don't think it approaches an answer. I don't think Park's goal was to give a finite answer because it is a very ambiguous question. I don't think you can really give it a true answer.
Yeah.
But I think the intent is to examine what history is. And I said this to you, I don't remember if it was right after I finished it or while we were both kind of actively reading it. I think the Korean War and the history of Korea was such a perfect historical setting to do that because, obviously I don't think I even really fully grasped this until I read this book, about how the Korean War is often called the Forgotten War.
Yeah.
And, I was thinking about this on my way over here today. I certainly don't remember a lot about any of it, but I remember being in middle school, high school, things like that, and like learning bits and pieces about Chinese history and bits and pieces about Japanese history. I don't really remember ever learning anything about Korean history.
Yeah.
And, I'm totally falling off from the plot here, but basically, like, this book is about Korean history. And it's about, all of these people whose lives have been affected in some way or another by the history of Korea. And it really, again, examines like what does history mean? What is history? Because, all of these connections like have come up, and I don't really want to spoil any of them. I'm trying to articulate my thoughts without giving away how things connect and things like that. But like, you'll have one guy who is someone who fought in the Korean War, or someone who was part of the founding of this Korean provisional government in like pre-Korean War, pre-World War II, who kind of domino effect somehow connects to the history of, or the life of one of the like present day characters.
Yeah.
And I think, again, that's what this book is about how these like actions build up and connect individual people and their lives to things that have happened in the past, and how the actions of history affect the present.
Yeah. I think that's a fair analysis. For me, I think the name of the book is really appropriate because, so a lot of people don't know this, that the concept of North and South Korea is not very old.
Right.
It's not how the countries were formed. The country ended up that way after World War II, basically. Previously, Korea had been a more or less unified country. And I think the name Same Bed, Different Dreams really puts into perspective that the South Koreans and North Koreans are in bed together. They're in the same situation.
Right.
But they have like different visions, different ideas of what unification looks like. Because that is a lot of the conversation around North and South Korea is about unification and will these two countries ever come back together to be one again? And what people don't know is that the countries were separated arbitrarily by basically like U.S. generals or U.S. politicians. And that meant that that line was drawn in the sand and families were separated. You know, people who were, their parents were living in the North and they were going to school in the South or vice versa or whatever. They just got cut off from one another. I think the book is a lot about racism. I think it almost frames the racism against Koreans and Asian peoples in general and kind of like highlights how absurd it is.
Yeah.
One part that really sticks out, and one thing Ed Park does an amazing job with is his pop culture references.
Yes.
The guy's like pop culture knowledge blows my mind. And if you look up pretty much anyone in this book, they're either a real person and things actually went down as ridiculously as they're portrayed in the book, or the names or characters are derived from a real thing. Like Parker Jotter is a popular character or is a prominent character in the book. Parker Jotter is a very popular type of pen, like a fountain pen.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know if you knew that.
I didn't.
It's like a ball. I don't know if it's fountain or ballpoint or whatever, but apparently it's like everyone's like, oh, you got to get a Parker Jotter pen. Like that's the best one. So it's just kind of funny, like stuff like that. The character's named after that. So,
all right.
But in the 70s, the Buffalo Sabres hockey team, their coach was kind of fed up with the draft and thought that it took too long. So to troll everybody, the very last moments of the draft, he said they were going to draft Taro Tsujimoto from Japan. And he plays for the Katanas in Japan, right? And everyone's like, well, who is this person? We've never heard of him. It's a made-up character. He literally made this person up. It's fictional.
Yeah.
Just to like troll everyone in the NHL. And then in the book, one of the characters who's Korean is coming out of a mall and some like dumbass Americans are like, oh, you know, they see an Asian guy like, oh, Taro, oh, you know, say what the puck, Taro, what the puck, you know? And they're just like, Asian, must be this guy. You know what I mean? Like, it's just that obvious demonstration of racism. I just think stuff like that's so clever.
Yeah.
It's a wildly funny book too. I laughed out loud multiple times. They were talking at one point about Thomas Pynchon, who was a Korean who shot and killed a Japanese general or some politician because Japan was colonizing Korea in the turn of the century, and he assassinated this guy. And they're talking about Thomas Pynchon, and then later in the conversation, someone says and they go, no, on, like, but they're just like, they're not saying his name, they're just going, oh yeah, yeah, I get it.
Yeah,
you know, stuff like that's really funny to me. I didn't think that you needed to know anything about Korean history to really appreciate the book, but I do think that as much as I know did help.
Yeah. I don't ever feel like I was like so out of the loop that I couldn't place it contextually.
Right.
You know, like I didn't know any of the Korean history he refers to, but I was still able to follow along with the narrative and understand what was going on in the context of the book. Yeah. So I think that that's a really strong point of the book. I think it's something that Park does really well, where he takes a lot of, you know, historical references and pop culture references, like you said, like all of these different references from every kind of different facet. Yeah. And like he talks about Tim Horton in the book, crashing his car and dying. Crazy. That really happened. Yeah. And whether or not the characters in the book have conversations around these events. Yeah. And there's no way of knowing if these conversations really happened, but the events that they're talking about that or the catalyst for the conversations are real events. Yeah. But I think he just organizes it in a way that, like I said, even if you don't understand the reference or know the history behind it, you can still understand the book. Yeah, for sure. And I think that's really important. What would you say it's about? I mean, I kind of took a stab at it. What would you How would you describe it in a couple of sentences?
Like I said before, I think it's really just about, it's a metaphor for modern day Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at North Korea in particular, we kind of have a cartoonish, I think Americans have or Westerners in general have a cartoonish opinion of North Korea. To us, North Korea seems very cartoonish. And it kind of is. But I think Park really highlights the absurdity and almost like the slapstick nature of how some of these events unfolded. Yeah, there's like, I think all the stuff about Kim Jong-il being like a movie buff, I think all that's real.
I love it.
And there's a brief mention of it in the book about his younger brother drowning. That really happened. He drowned, and the belief that it's told in the Western world is that he actually drowned his younger brother.
Oh, damn.
Because he thought that his younger brother was going to be the one to succeed Kim Il-sung, the father. And so when they were kids, his younger brother drowned. But the rumor is that he actually drowned his younger brother.
Oh, wow.
And then so it's kind of funny in the book how, like, and this is a small spoiler, it's not really that important, integral to the story, but he's like, Kim Jong-il's, this movie buff, and he's like watching these movies and he's like having these imaginary conversations with his brother who's also like a big fan, but it's like, you killed him, dude.
Right.
Like, so I think it's about racism, and I think it is like kind of a look at the absurdity of Korean history in general. Yeah. And I do really appreciate it because you could maybe not learn, you could learn a lot about Korean history from reading this, but I think it would pique your interest.
Right.
And I find Korean history to, as you know, extremely interesting.
Yeah.
And for people that aren't familiar, the reason why I have an interest in Korean history is because of weightlifting. So in 2015, the World Weightlifting Championships were held in Texas, and it was the first time they were going to be held in the U.S. in 40 years. So I went, and the way weightlifting works is there's like 7 or 8 weight categories for men, 7 or 8 weight categories for women. And usually like the competitions last several days. So on day 1, it's like the 2 lightest, the lightest men's and lightest women's weight classes compete. They do their thing, and then the next day it moves up to the next couple weight classes. And so the athletes have to be there for the whole week. They're there training and adjusting to the time change and all that stuff. But like, let's say you compete on Friday and it's Tuesday, like you have nothing else to do aside from your one workout than just sit around and watch weightlifting. So it's really an interesting experience because as a fan, you're literally sitting amongst like Olympians and world champions and Olympic medalists and all these amazing athletes because they just have nothing else to do. And so you'd see people from all over the world, and then you see the North Korean team. And North Korea is actually pretty good at Olympic-style weightlifting. So all these athletes would be by themselves. Like, oh, there's a guy from Argentina, there's somebody from Russia, whatever. But the North Koreans were always all together as a group. Mm-hmm. And I had this epiphany, and you've heard this story a million times, Andy, but I had this epiphany that you can go to any major city in the U.S. and see people from every country in the world. Not North Korea.
Not North Korea.
Because they're only allowed out of the country for sporting events or things of that nature. So I was like, holy crap, like I'm seeing like a unicorn. You know what I mean? Like it just kind of blew my mind. And I actually grabbed a photo with a couple of them. I'll drop the photos into the YouTube version of this podcast. But I got home and I was just like, this is insane. Like I need to know everything there is to know about North Korea now. So I bought a bunch of books. I read a bunch of books. I just started getting really interested in North Korea. And of course, you typically start with like defectors and their stories, and then you gravitate to Westerners who are supposed experts. But all that stuff is somewhat tainted. It's skewed by our Western views of North Korea. And so I don't feel like it's really a fair shake. And obviously, like anybody who's defected hated it enough to leave.
Right.
So there's some bias there as well. And then you start going, okay, like how did like North Korea even like get started? And then you learn about the Korean War, which, like you mentioned, there's zero education about that in the U.S. And a really brief history for people that didn't know. Korea was a sovereign nation, had, like most cultures, a lot of warring inside the country itself. I'm talking like going back to BC throughout the centuries. And then they would battle with China and vice versa, and they would kind of take over in China, and China would take over in Korea, and they would going back and forth. And then there was a small period of peace. This is getting a little off the rails, but this is an important piece of history. So in the late 1800s, maybe like the 1870s, there was a admiral for the U.S. military, Matthew Perry, and he ran an Asiatic expedition. And they went to Japan, and Japan was kind of a hermit kingdom at that point. And they said, we want to use your port for trade. And Japan was like, not interested, bounce. And they're like, nah. And they're like, if you don't let us land and kind of do our thing, we're going to like basically bomb the shit out of you guys. Because we had big ships with cannons and the whole 9 yards. We had the artillery. This was a huge embarrassment for Japan. And so they kind of got, colonized slightly by Western influence at that point, from because trade was opened up, and then obviously we came in and kind of did all of our damage. And this was a huge source of embarrassment for Japan. So for the next like 30 to 40 years, they pushed really hard to industrialize because they were so ashamed of they had no response to these ships coming in and basically threatening them. So they started to model themselves after the British Empire, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the American Empire, even though we don't refer to it as that. That's basically what we were. And so
Still are.
Yeah. Yeah. So in, 1900, the early 1900s, Japan's like, well, all these other guys are going into other countries and taking over. And like, we're just going to do the same thing. And they went into Korea, and they colonized Korea, and they were under Japanese imperial rule up through World War II. And then, World War II, Nagasaki, Hiroshima, we completely, just the war in general, was just so taxing on Japan. They didn't have the means to continue an occupation, and we weren't going to let them anyway, just because, we demilitarized Japan. And so that's when the split between North and South came, because same bed, different dreams, right? Like,
right.
Americans wanted Korea to be a quote unquote democracy and capitalist society, and the Soviets wanted Korea to be modeled after communism. And we instilled a puppet government with Syngman Rhee, who's a prominent figure in this book.
Yeah,
and it's just been a shit show since then, pretty much. So, but nobody knows any of this. Like in America, people don't know this.
Right.
So, yeah, to me, it's super fascinating. It's kind of wild how things played out, the differences between North and South Korea now. And Park touches on it in this book. There's a lot of parallels to Vietnam, the way Americans treat Asian peoples, whether they're Vietnamese, Korean, Chinese, Japanese, to Westerners. A lot of times it's just all the same, quote unquote. So, yeah, super interesting book. Anything you didn't like about it?
That there wasn't more of it. I think
I was waiting for that.
I was talking to someone when I finished it. Like I don't mean this in the sense that like anything was rushed or anything like that. Like I just selfishly was enjoying it so much that like I just wanted more and more of it.
Sure.
No, I don't think there was anything that like I strongly disliked or even just kind of generally disliked. I think we can talk about the structure a little bit, but like typically, how you alluded to this earlier, the dream sequences, they're kind of broken down into that fragmentary bullet point style, and typically, works like that where it's so fragmented, like really don't connect well with me. But I think, something about the way that like Park set it up and how, obviously it's not, the entire book isn't like that. Like you said, it starts off a little like, not confusing, but it's a little, shaky. And then as you get further into it, like it makes sense.
Yeah.
And excuse me. So no, I don't really have anything that I disliked. We can talk about the structure a little bit. Like, what did you make of it? I mean, obviously it's broken up into different narratives, but there's kind of three different, not necessarily three, there's two main narratives, and then there's a third that kind of is all ancillary characters and stories and things like that.
Yeah.
But what I thought was really interesting was the way it's not just three separate plot points. There's the separation of the narrative, but they're also all written in totally different styles.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting. I don't think you see that very often.
Yeah, the structure of the book is so unique. I can see some people maybe not liking it, and there was definitely times where, so there are, as you mentioned, kind of different narratives and plot lines, and some of the book is written in a very straightforward fashion.
Mm-hmm.
I would say my only critique is there's like some storylines that are in that more traditional narrative that I kind of wish had a little stronger resolution.
Yeah.
But again, I mean,
I think I feel the same way. I didn't even.
that's the same as what you said. It's like I just wish there was.
I just wish there was more,
Right.
and I think it's something that I kind of struggle to come to grasps with in most books, like you said, like there's a handful of these connections where you never get like a full resolution.
Yeah.
It's just kind of an idea of what happened, or a little push in the direction of how things kind of came together.
Yeah.
And it's something that like it totally is dependent on the book and how it's written. I either love when it does that, or it just drives me nuts.
Yeah.
And I haven't really figured out if there's any sort of formula to like when I enjoy it or why I don't like it. It's just like, I think Park did a really good job of it, like giving you just enough to like kind of start to outline it for you.
Yeah.
And then you have to fill in the blanks. You can kind of make your own predictions about what happened, or, he just leaves it open-ended. And I think, again, because of the way the book is set up to examine history,
Yeah.
and how these little things kind of snowball, I think it's selfishly, like I wanted more. I wanted to see how they resolved and how they came together. But I think in the grand scheme of the book, like it makes a little bit more sense to leave them kind of open-ended.
Well, I mean, the Korean question is open-ended.
Right.
Like is Korea going to unify?
Right.
They've been talking about that since it split in 1945.
Right.
I think what you talked about before, questioning what is history, the beginning of the second dream sequence, it says questions. What is history? A vital lesson. B, amusement for the idle. C, the sum of symbols. And D, a record of pain. Which is like, yeah, it's kind of all those things. It's none of those things.
Right. It's also the first sentence of the book. The first sentence of the book is what is history? That is the question. That is the job.
Yeah. It's such a unique book. Park did such a great job. I really want to chat with him about how do you even write a book like this?
Right.
Like it's not linear. There's so many elements. I wonder if he started to tie some of these things together himself and just expounded on that, or if he just kind of forced things together to make it work. I don't know. It's
none of it ever felt forced to me, though.
Yeah,
like
I agree.
They all felt like very natural connections, or even if it wasn't, like I never would like, how did those two end up, or like what happened there? Like that doesn't make any sense. Like
right.
it all just kind of seemed like it made sense that this is how this kind of tied in.
What's really funny is in the book, there's a dog that eats the book, Same Bed, Different Dreams. And while I was reading this, one of my dogs came up and took a big chomp out of. I was just sitting there reading, and she just came up and like. I was like, oh, okay, cool. So I have some bite marks on some of the pages here. Yeah, it's just a wacky, fun novel, and I do think it's cool if people learn a little bit in the process.
What I think is so awesome about it is that for as much depth as there is to it and as much discussion as that can be had around it, it's still so accessible.
Yeah.
Like,
I thought there was very few words I had to look up.
Like, you can just have this like surface level reading and enjoy the book and totally be fine with that. And it's not just this, like, it's this like historical epic that's hitting you with these references and like, there's a lot of stuff about the horrific treatment of the Korean people, both, around the turn of the century when Japan was starting to colonize it and stuff during the start of the Korean War and that split between North and South. Like it touches on the treatment these people went through, and it's all very like sad and heartbreaking, but like it's still such a fun book.
Yeah, it really is.
Like it's such an enjoyable read.
So much of it, as you know, is about the Korean Provisional Government. And so people probably on the face of it aren't familiar with that is. Basically, during the Japanese occupation, there was obviously like attempts to defy or, coups, or maybe the thought of a coup to take their sovereignty back. And so it was kind of, I don't know if ragtag is like the right way to put it, but it was just kind of like not a super organized thing. And then when World War II happened and Japan got bombed, people thought, okay, now Korea's going to get their independence back. And that was like such a short-lived thing because very soon after Korean War happened, where two people that literally have nothing to do with Korea, America and the Soviet Union, two groups that have nothing to do with Korea, are the ones saying we're going to make the decisions.
Right.
And so, and then the U.S. set up their kind of puppet government in the South, and Kim Il-sung was put into power by the Soviets in the North. Kim Il-sung actually had quite a bit of fame at that point for fighting against Japan during the Japanese occupation. But so there was always these like kind of like governments, but they weren't really legit. They actually talk about the faked elections in the South in this book, which is something that really happened. I've talked about that before. And so it kind of makes a joke out of it, right? Like they talk about like Christianity's influence in Korea, and then they're like, Jesus Christ is a member of the Korean Provisional Government.
Right.
It's kind of just like almost making a joke out of how illegitimate the whole thing kind of was, and how there was warring factions within the KPG, and it's just a really incredible book. I assume you gave this 5 stars.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And you said it'll probably be one of your favorite books of the year that you've read.
Yes, definitely. I think it'll probably end up being top 5 at least, if not top 3. I think I've read a lot of books that I have really enjoyed, and a lot of books that have asked a lot of me this year that I think will rank pretty highly, but there's only been a few of them that have been like such a pleasure to read.
Yeah.
And like I've truly gotten like swept up in,
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to put it down.
Yeah, I certainly didn't either.
But it's a beefy book. I mean, they're tall pages.
Yeah.
The font is maybe slightly smaller than average, and it's 520 pages. So,
yeah.
Anything else you want to add about Same Bed, Different Dreams? Ed Park, please come on our podcast and talk to us about your cool book.
Yeah. No, the only thing I have to say is go and read it. I've gotten a handful of messages from people on Instagram asking me if the hype is real, if it's worth it, if it really is a good book as myself and other people on Instagram are making it out to be.
Yeah.
I think it's an astounding work of fiction. I think the hype is real. I was thinking about it a little bit prior to coming over today. Like, it's been very invigorating to see a new release kind of like this.
Yeah, if you think about those kind of lit bro, big name books, we haven't had one. I since think, maybe Infinite Jest, and this could maybe be close to that,
right? I wasn't really on the scene with like some of Pynchon's more recent releases. I think he's had 3 come out since the turn of the century.
I mean, like Inherent Vice is a good book, but no one's going to be like, this is a magnificent work of modern literature.
But I'm sure there was still a lot of excitement around the release. But I think with the popularity and the kind of growth of like bookish corners of social media, I think you see a lot of hype around new releases. They're not typically the type of books that you or I like to read.
Right. There's one sitting on this table right now.
But gave
to me.
Like, I don't think anyone has been able to escape like even if you don't care about the book or don't whatever, like I don't think anyone has been able to avoid coming across any kind of content about something like Fourth Wing.
Yeah.
Or like any of the books in that kind of vein that have come out recently. And those aren't really like my type of book.
Yeah, it's pop fiction.
It's pop fiction.
Television on paper.
But I think, it's just so cool to be a part of something like this where it's a work of literature, but it's still fun and accessible. It's not this like snobby, pretentious.
Yeah. The writing doesn't feel pretentious at all.
Right. But again, like it's still this weighty book that's got a lot of serious ideas and things like that. And it's been fun to be a part of the kind of hype around a book like that. That's not just, like you said, television on paper.
Right.
I feel very fortunate to have gotten a review copy from Random House and to be an early reader.
Well, that's a good point too, is you don't typically see books like this coming out from big major publications anymore, like Random House.
Right.
They're usually reserved for those smaller independent presses, which is great.
Right.
And fine. But it is cool to see, one of the biggest names in publishing put out such a bizarre and off the beaten path book. I think that's really positive for
I agree.
Reading culture in general.
Yeah.
And so I think actually Ed Park used to work as an editor, or still does work as an editor for Penguin or Random House or one of those, or maybe. I don't know if maybe that had something to do with how it ended up on this publication, but I do think it is a very positive thing.
He was a founding editor of The Believer, which is, I think, a lit magazine.
Oh, cool.
The literary editor of The Village Voice, and an editor at Penguin Press.
Oh, there you go. So maybe that had something to do with it.
Yeah.
Because Penguin Random House is now a thing. So, all right. Anything else you want to add before we wrap this up?
No.
Profound.
I don't think so.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your questions for the Q&A. If you haven't yet, go pick up your copy of Same Bed, Different Dreams. If you don't like it, you can blame myself or Andy. And if you'd like to see Ed Park on the podcast, let us know. We'll maybe cajole him. He is somewhat active on social media.
Yeah.
I'm sure he's a very busy person, and understandably some artists prefer not to be on camera and recording. So, anywho, we will see you guys next week in the next episode.